My name is Laura Martin. I'm the co-executive director of the Exeter Historical Society. And am I blowing you out with my, okay, thank you. I'm glad you're here, whether you are here in person or online on Zoom or watching on Exeter TV. Thank you for coming to hear Reviving the History of Exeter's Black Revolutionary War veterans and their families. As always, I'd like to thank Exeter TV for bringing all of our programs to our members and friends virtually. Okay, sorry, for which we are always grateful. Okay, thank you. Next month's program will be Tuesday, November 4th, right here at 7 p.m. Exeter's own Jack Herney will explore the story of Oliver Moulton Chadwick and the Chadwick family. We'll hope to see you there. But before that, we're holding our annual trivia night on Monday, October 27th at Sea Dog Brewing Company, and it will be a fun night of history trivia. The cover includes refreshments. You can buy tickets on our website. And once again, Barbara Rimkunas will be the quiz master. Doors will open at 6. It will start at 7 p.m. Don't miss Trick or Trivia. Tonight, if you'd like to ask a question and you're here in person, please raise your hand and one of us will run towards you or walk quickly with a microphone. That enables both Barbara to hear you and people who are on Zoom. And now for the main event. It's always a pleasure for me to introduce my friend and coworker, Barbara Rimkunas. Barbara grew up in Falmouth, Maine, and earned her bachelor's and master's degrees at the University of Maine and New Hampshire, respectively. In her past lives, she has worked as an archaeologist and in patient registration at the Exeter Hospital ER. Most importantly to us, she has been the curator at the Exeter Historical Society for over 25 years. You've probably read her historically speaking columns and/or seen her present other programs and/or caught her in one of our over 150 Exeter History Minutes. She's pretty awesome, and I'm going to turn it over to her to read the land acknowledgement. Thank you.
Loud? Fine? We're fine. Good. All right. Tonight's program takes place in Misquamscook, now called Exeter, in Nadakina, the traditional ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples past and present. We acknowledge and honor with gratitude the Alnabak, the people, who have stewarded Nadakina and its Aki, Nibi, Olaquakak, and Oasak, the land, the waterways, the flora, and the fauna throughout the generations. It's good to know where you're standing. Tonight's program was originally presented at the Dublin Seminar of Folklore and Folklife in June of 2025, this past summer. I worked a long time on it. At the time that I presented it, I was allowed 20 to 25 minutes to do the whole thing. So it is a read presentation, and the good news is you don't have to hear me do it a mile a minute because we have time. You're going to learn a little bit. The theme of that particular seminar, by the way, was recalling the Revolution in New England. So we were looking at themes of how the revolutionary soldiers, the revolutionary time period was remembered over time. And so my choice was to focus in on some of the Black Revolutionary War veterans who lived in Exeter, who came to Exeter after the war. You're also going to learn a little bit about how we do this kind of research. because you can't just open a book and hope that someone's already told you all about these people. We're talking about a marginalized population for whom there were very few records. So how do we find that information? And that's where we're starting from. The state of New Hampshire is very white. The 2020 census data says that we are 88% white, and the town of Exeter is even whiter than the rest of the state. With a population of about 16,000 people, Exeter is 95.5% white. It's incredibly easy to dismiss the topic of Black history in the state of New Hampshire when the lived experience of residents, particularly those who've lived here for decades, includes the ability to count the number of Black residents on one hand. And yet, Exeter at one time had a much higher Black population, and this is a well-known fact. Just after the American Revolution, the Black population of Exeter, according to census records, was 4.8%, nearly 5% of the population. At that time, the major ethnicities in the town were, in order, English, Scot, and West Coast African. Most of the Black population was free, and many were Revolutionary War veterans and their families. This is a census record that we have in our archives. Before the war in 1767, a census was taken in the town of Exeter revealing that there were 50 enslaved people living in town, or 2.9% of the population. This census does not indicate whether there were free Blacks living in town, as it was primarily concerned with tabulating the number of men available for militia service. Women were not counted by age, only by marital status. A similar census taken in 1791, which you see on the bottom, which notably is even less concerned with women, indicates only 2 enslaved people in Exeter, but an increase in the number of free persons, that's the non-white population, bringing the Black population of Exeter up to that 4.8%, which is quite a bump. When we look at the official 1790 census, we find that out of the 81 free Black people living in Exeter, 25 people are living within white households, as servants, for instance. The other 56 are living in 13 Black households. Of these 13 Black households, 8 are headed by Revolutionary War veterans, and 1 is headed by a Revolutionary War widow. We don't have an exact tally of the number of Black soldiers from New Hampshire, although Glenn Knobloch estimates 139 men who served in the New Hampshire forces, 34 who served in both New Hampshire and other states' forces, and 51 men who served in the forces of other colonies but lived in New Hampshire at some point in their lives. When I first arrived at the Exeter Historical Society in 2000, we had a small archival box. By small, I mean this size. Think of it as a file box. So we store all of our records on the inside. So we had this much documentation on the African American population in Exeter. My predecessor, Nancy Merrill, was unable to build a full picture of the size and contributions of the population because there was just no internet genealogical resources. She didn't have the ability to travel and find sources. And so that's what she was able to collect from some really unusual sources. It became obvious, though, that the usual means of research, particularly genealogical research, was very incomplete. When working up the genealogy of white residents in Exeter, we can search for baptismal birth records, marriage records, death records, burial markers. These can be assisted by using land deeds, wills, and probate records, and participation in town government. That's how we find white people. They're pretty well documented. For marginalized people, however, there may be none of these documents. Marriages and births are frequently unrecorded. I have not yet uncovered any sales records for enslaved people, and I have not found any manumission records for people in Exeter. Where then can we find information about the lives of these Exeter people? In 2004, Mark Sammons and Valerie Cunningham published their groundbreaking work, Black Portsmouth, 3 Centuries of African American Heritage. Although Sammons was the primary author of the book, it was Cunningham. This is Valerie Cunningham. I put her picture up here instead of the book because, yay, Valerie Cunningham. Cunningham, who taught us how to find the stories of a mostly unrecorded people. Her relentless pursuit of Portsmouth's Black heritage led to the creation of New Hampshire's Black Heritage Trail. She looked at all sorts of things, church records, local stories, anything she could lay her hands on, anything she could find. At a recent meeting of the New Hampshire Archives Group, Tanya Marshall, the Vermont State Archivist, so these are archivists, reminded those of us who work in archives that this is our time to shine. None of us believed her, given the current challenging environment of defunding, lack of access, and the prevalence of disinformation, malinformation, and misinformation. She reminded us that in spite of this, we work in a world of facts. Records are facts, and it is our place to educate about the importance of archival collections. In order to do this, she recommended that we adhere to basic archival rules surrounding authentication, verification, and context. In order to present information in our collections as truth, we need to confirm the content is authentic and accurate while still collecting information that might be somewhat unreliable. This all fits together in the world of archives, but as I listened to her, I realized this is the same strategy that we usually use when we're seeking information about a group like Exeter's early Black community, because it turns out there are many, many stories and written accounts about people of very dubious reliability. The stories, not the people. They're all written by white people. Most were written as reminiscences later in a person's life, and as you know, you try to remember what kindergarten was like, you may not be sure if you're getting the facts right, so sometimes that can get past us. So here's the way that we go about it. To determine where the facts could be found, the process becomes: verify the origin of the account. So if you see it in a newspaper or in a book or in an article, find out where it started. Find its birth. Who wrote it first and when was it written? When was it published, and who the author was, if you can find that author. Then figure out how close the author was geographically and chronologically to the person in the account. So if they're writing about a particular person, make sure you know if the person writing about them even met them, right? That's fairly important. Determine whether another account, not based on this one, agrees with it, because sometimes you'll get an account of a person and then the next person tells the same story, but it's the same story, and then the next person says this person told it, but it's just the same story being told over and over and over, and it may not have been true in the first place. So you do have to watch for that. Verify details of the account, the people, the places, the material, culture, the language patterns, to verify that this could have happened at that time period with this person. And then keep an eye on the context in which the account occurs. Why was this written? Okay, that's how we do it. That's how we take unreliable accounts of Exeter's Black population. Specifically, today we're going to look at 3 people, families really, connected to the American Revolution and how we use this method to tell their stories. The first person we're going to talk about, or 2 people actually, it's a mother and daughter. Hannah Holland Merrill and her daughter Catherine Merrill. The first mention of Hannah Holland Merrill is in a piece published in the Exeter Newsletter, our local newspaper, in 1879. It was written by an anonymous author who signed their account simply with the letter L. The account is titled New Guinea, which begins, at the commencement, there's going to be a lot of quotes in this. Do you want me to hold my hand up if I'm quoting, or are you good? I changed my voice a little. At the commencement of the present century, and for 15 or 20 years later, there was quite a population of colored people resident in this town. Many of these, and probably the larger part, were ex-slaves who had been manumitted by the Revolution and from circumstances growing out of the same. These people have all disappeared. This is 1879. Have all disappeared, and but a few of their descendants remain among us. My recollections of the colored people extends back to 1806, that determines the chronological marker. Of Hannah and her daughter, they write, next, north of Zach Robinson's, dwelt Hannah and Katie Holland. I remember but little about them. They appeared to live a comfortable and quiet life. They had for a boarder old Conadun, who had been a slave to Colonel Phillips, the founder of the academy. Conadun lived to be over 100 years old. Elle appears to know very little about Hannah Merrill's background, except for the detail that she boarded John Phillips' formerly enslaved man Corydon for a time. Another author, Benjamin Swayze, a local historian, mentions Hannah's daughter Catherine somewhat indirectly in one of his Notes on Early Exeter columns published in the Exeter Newsletter in 1908. Swayze was a lifelong resident of Exeter, born in 1837. His history writing is generally quite reliable, and we often use it with genealogists to affirm family lines, because he just remembers families really well. As Hannah Holland Merrill died in 1823, Swayze never met her in person. He did most likely meet her daughter Catherine, who lived until 1852. Here's what Swayze wrote. In 1832, George Odeon, then a successful merchant and manufacturer of Boston, sold his property on Green Street, which had 2 dwellings upon it. He deposited the amount of this sale, the interest of which should form a perpetual annuity for the benefit of the deserving colored persons of Exeter. This is known as the Kate Holland Fund. You'll already notice nobody's named Kate Holland. 2 years later, Dr. William Perry, who was 87 at the time, wrote his memories of Exeter, which included a child's recollection of Catherine. There was old Katie, who lived in a cottage long ago torn down in what was called Lover's Lane. I never knew her last name, but I remember her well. We children had the impression that she was a miser. Instead of stockings, she wore strips of cotton cloth wound round her ankles in uneven folds. I do not know what she did for a living, as I was never thrown in her way. So these accounts give us the following picture. Hannah Holland and her daughter Katie lived in a small home, appeared to be quite comfortable, boarded a former slave of John Phillips. Katie was a bit miserly and wore cotton strips instead of stockings, and for some reason, George Odeon, a local merchant, left a sum of money to the town for colored citizens, which was called the Kate Holland Fund. To unlock the story of Hannah Holland Merrill and Catherine Merrill, it was first necessary to unravel the names of those involved. Hannah Holland's first appearance in town records ever occurs on August 3rd, 1777, when she is married in Exeter to Juba Merrill of Newbury, Massachusetts, by the Reverend Isaac Mansfield. Juba Merrill was a free black man at the time of the wedding, but his origins are unknown beyond this fact. In Newbury, his occupation was yeoman or farmer. For her part, Hannah's origins are even more murky. Her birth year of 1740 is derived from census records, so we're basically guessing. She appears to be from Exeter, although her origins and parentage are unknown. In any event, she and Juba were careful to have their marriage recorded in both Exeter and Newbury, so there could be no doubt that they were legally married. The births of their children, Catherine in 1778 and Mark in 1780, were recorded in the Newbury town records. Juba joined the Continental Service in 1781, and he died the following year at West Point of a fever. Hannah Merrill was then left with 3 children. There's a third, Ruth, who was born, but not recorded, sometime after 1780. Hannah Merrill, now a Revolutionary War widow with 3 small children, decided to return to New Hampshire. To do so, she was required to place her children under the guardianship of the court. In 1794, guardianship was transferred to George Odeon. But only Catherine and Mark are mentioned. We don't know what became of Ruth, but likely her life was short. The 1790 census lists Hannah as Hannah Holland as the head of the household. You can see her name at the very last one there, in lovely handwriting, which is very unusual for this time. It's a misnomer because it's using her maiden name. And remember, she went out of her way to make sure she was listed as married. The 1800 census lists, which I don't have a picture of, lists Hannah Negro, no surname given, as no surnames were given for the black population of Exeter in 1800. The 1810 census lists that there are black people living in town, but they have hardly any names. And Hannah's does not appear on it. In 1800, Mark, who was now 20 years old, had evidently left home. 8 years later, Hannah Merrill was appointed administrator of the estate of Mark Merrill, late of Exeter, Mariner. As executrix, Hannah discovered that her children's guardian, George Odeon, held a bond for both Mark and Catherine. These were paid out $189.80 for each child, which was a fortune back then. The 1820 census finally lists Hannah Merrill using her full legal name. She's living with her daughter Catherine. Hannah's death is handwritten in the town record on January 4th, 1823 as Widow Hannah Merrill, commonly called Hannah Holland. You can just barely see it written right underneath deaths in 1823. Hannah Merrill, commonly called Hannah Holland. But why would she be commonly called Hannah Holland? Married women as well as widows were granted the right, perhaps the requirement, to use their husband's surnames. Black residents were not granted the same rights to surnames, at least not in common usage. In denying Hannah the use of her married name, and unlike many black citizens, she was careful to have her marriage recorded, she stripped of her association with her husband, Jude Merrill, a Revolutionary War soldier. The erasure of Hannah Merrill's marriage continued into the next generation. Catherine Merrill, her sole survivor, inherited her mother's estate, which included her brother's estate. During the decades that followed her mother's death, Catherine invested in local real estate, purchasing land in the vicinity of her home, which would today be called Park Street, and renting out small houses, often to black families. She purchased her own home on Park Street. On several occasions, she purchased land and buildings on Green Street from George Odeon, who was her former financial guardian. With assistance from Samuel Hatch, another neighbor, she executed mortgage deeds for two of her white neighbors, John Foss and Joseph Fernald. Both were paid back in full with interest. Not wishing to die intestate like her father, mother, and brother, Catherine drafted a will in 1837, assisted by Samuel Hatch. It was Catherine Merrill, not George Odeon, who left a bequest to the town of Exeter to the relief of such colored persons having their settlement in said Exeter, but not paupers therein, as in consequence of sickness, youth, or old age may need occasionally assistance. She died in 1852. Her death notice in the Exeter newsletter says, Miss Catherine Holland, colored person, age 74, infuriatingly using her mother's maiden name, which delegitimizes her very birth. Her legacy to the town was placed, nearly forgotten, in a bank account at the Union 5-cent Savings Bank. 42 years later, they found the fund again. It was finally explained by ex-town clerk Belknap, who recalled the fact that many years ago the town had received from one Kate Holland a bequest of which the income should benefit deserving colored residents. It was reinvested, and the trust fund was thereafter dubbed the Kate Holland Fund. This despite the fact that legally there was no person named Kate Holland, and any connection between Catherine Merrill and her Revolutionary War soldier father Jude Merrill were forgotten. The fund still exists, although it is rarely used. It's now designated for colored people. For local historians, the confusion of Hannah Holland, Hannah no surname, and Hannah Merrill might potentially lead to the conclusion that these were three discrete people. That the town of Exeter also had a very prominent white family with the name Merrill may have added to the reluctance to provide Hannah and her daughter with the same name, lest the two become linked. For their part, both women used Merrill when signing any legal documents, and I hope you noticed that they both signed the documents using an X. Neither one of them, let's see if this pointer works. There we go. That's Catherine's, I'll come over here. That's Catherine's signature down there. Were they literate? They might have been. It's very hard to tell. Sometimes people can read, but they have difficulty writing. So we don't really know. Untangling these became quite difficult unless you went all the way back. If Holland is being commonly used as a name for Hannah and Catherine, it didn't come from either of those two women. The graves of Hannah and Catherine Merrill are unmarked. They're probably buried over in the Winter Street Cemetery. The timing is right. Now let's talk about Oxford Tash. Oxford Tash's life began at age 25. As so often, that's where the paper trail begins, at age 25. Before that, we have nothing written about him. His parents are a mystery because his birth was not registered. He was most likely born in 1750, enslaved from birth in Newmarket, New Hampshire. He was from Newmarket, we are very sure of that. Charles Bell, an Exeter historian writing about Exeter's black residents in 1888, tells us, one of these was Oxford Tash, who died October 14, 1810, at the age of about 60. He had probably been brought up a servant in the family of Colonel Thomas Tash of Newmarket, and perhaps was freed as a reward for his military service. He was wounded in action, but with a high sense of honor, refused to apply for a pension for as long as he was able to support himself. Bell never met Oxford Tash, but no doubt he had heard about the man. This could explain why he used the more genteel servant instead of the word slave when writing about him, although that's really a New England thing. They don't like to talk about their slaves, they like to talk about their servants. It means the same thing, it's just code. Tash had numerous children, including Charles, of whom Bell says he was of excellent manners and high-spirited like his father. The father he had never met, of course. This is just a slide to show you what part of town we're talking about, because I don't have a lot of images. But this is down on Outer Water Street. What you see there is Water Street, where Swayze Parkway is today. Going up, where Park Street is, you can see Hannah Merrill's house, way over on the side. And the Tash family lived down here. There's Robert Tash and there's Charles Tash. By the time this map was made in 1845, Oxford Tash was no longer living. Dr. William Perry did not meet Oxford Tash either. Perry was born 13 years after Tash's death. He mentions Oxford Tash only in relation to his son Charles Tash, who he knew quite well. The father had been a soldier in the Revolutionary War and had been freed on account of his military service. Charles was a gentleman as far as manner and was concerned and high-spirited. The similar use of high-spirited leads one to wonder whether one writer is relying on the other, because they're pretty similar. The unknown author L appears to have known the family very well. The account published in 1879 provides quite a few details about them. Many other families of the colored race were scattered in different parts of the town. Among the most prominent of these families was that of Oxford Tash, who was doubtless an ex-slave. He lived in a house now standing and in good repair a few doors north of Mr. Josiah Batchelder's. This checks out with the map, by the way. Oxford had quite a family. I remember Bob, Charles, William, and Tilda. About 1802 or 3, Tilda and I went to the same school. Mrs. Tash, Bob's mother, was in her day somewhat noted as a fortune teller. While author L doesn't mention Oxford Tash's service in the war, they most likely met or knew of Tash during their lifetime. Tash's youngest daughter, Method Matilda, was born in 1799. The school dates might be off by just a few years, but L, recalling the early 1800s, also confirms that Exeter schools were integrated and that the illiterate Oxford Tash made an effort to send all of his children, including his youngest daughter, to school. Tash is most closely associated with Colonel Thomas Tash of Newmarket, his enslaver, of whom much is written. Commissioned in 1776 as a colonel under General George Washington, in 1778 he served with the New Hampshire legislature called the General Court, which met in Exeter. After the war, Colonel Tash moved his family to New Durham. Oxford Tash was known to be enslaved to the Tash family even by the Tash family. Colonel Tash's great-granddaughter, Blanche Adams Young, left notes contained in a letter that were printed in the Rochester Courier in 1948. She relates that, of the colonel, his wife Martha had her black girl named Lucy, called Luce for short, and he had his black man Oxford, an intelligent Negro. She makes no further mention of Oxford Tash, but the following is about Lucy, who was probably Oxford's sister. This is a long story, and it's a bit troubling. There is a story told of Black Luce, the black servant, which I must relate. She was often left to care for the little children of Colonel and Mrs. Tash when they journeyed from home. She was both ingenious and mischievous. One day she was dressing dolls for the girls, and having nothing to her liking, she spied a red velvet waistcoat. Taking her scissors, she cut big pieces from it and fashioned it into articles of dresses for the dolls. It suited fine, and when her master discovered what she had done, he punished her after his own fashion. He cut pieces of velvet and soaked them in gravy, and when all his family were dining, Black Luce was called into the room and told to stand before the fire and eat the red velvet for her dinner. This she tried to do, rolling her eyes and chewing hard. The children watched her as she chewed and chewed with amusement. After punishing her in this manner, her master felt satisfied that she would never cut up costly garments again, and she was allowed her place again in the household. Luce left New Durham after New Hampshire freed her slaves and went to Newburyport, I think, with some of her black race. Fun fact, New Hampshire never frees its slaves until the 13th Amendment gets passed. She became religious and sent a message to Mistress Tash. It went, "Tell my mistress, I have found my peace." Mrs. Tash pondered over it. Did Luce refer to the woman in the New Testament who lost the piece of silver and found it again? No one knew. But the pious black woman was a changed creature, loving her mistress to the end. One final account I'd like to mention is from Edith Green, who wrote this piece in 1938 when she was 61. Then there was Marm Tash, gentle, colored lady who lived on Newmarket Road and who supported herself by telling fortunes. The accounts we have regarding Oxford Tash tell us that he was enslaved to Colonel Thomas Tash of Newmarket. He served in the Revolutionary War. He was injured during that war, but refused an invalid pension until he truly needed it. He raised a family in Exeter where he was not impoverished and sent his children to school. He was high-spirited, according to people who never met him, and his wife was a fortune teller. So how do we untangle this story? This is not about Oxford Tash, but it is an example of a document that talks about how confusing names can be. There's ample evidence that Tash was born enslaved. That he used the name Tash indicates a connection between the families. Enslaved people in New England didn't always take the names of their enslavers, nor did they always change their surname when they were sold or bequeathed. This inconsistency, because sometimes they did, this inconsistency became problematic after the war when black soldiers tried to file for pensions. Oxford Tash did not encounter this problem because he always used Tash as his surname. His military records used Tash, as do all his legal filings. He does not appear to have been literate, or at least he was not able to write. This is a document that shows the difficulty that a man who served in the Revolution, whose name was Prime or Primus, had trying to get his pension, because different people had to attest as to what his last name was. And this man is writing, I think I knew him as Prime Lane, or maybe I just knew him as Prime. He might have been Prime Coffin. I don't know who owned him. And that's the kind of the thing that they had to go through. While living in Exeter, there's Oxford Tash's ex. While living in Exeter, Oxford Tash worked as a laborer, which must have been difficult considering he was living with war injuries. He'd been injured very badly in the thigh, so he walked with a pronounced limp for most of his life. He applied for and received a pension for disability in 1807 when he was about 57 years old, and he received $30 per year for the remaining 3 years of his life. The disability payments ended with Tash's death in 1810. His wife, Esther, was then left with no government support until the widow's pensions were approved by the federal government. She applied in 1838. Esther had her documents ready. Her marriage in Newburyport in 1781 was registered with the town. She obtained depositions from Enoch Rowe, Winthrop Wigan, and Nathaniel Gilman. All three testify that Tash entered the Army in 1776 in Enoch Poor's regiment. Enoch Rowe states he served in the same New Hampshire regiment with Tash in 1776, the two even suffering smallpox together. Esther Tash received her widow's pension, receiving $90 annually until her death in 1844. Her death notice in the Exeter newsletter reads, Mrs. Esther Tash, in her 87th year, relict, which just means widow, of Oxford Tash, a Revolutionary War pensioner. This is an admirable amount of respect in this notice. Use of her full name, she's not reduced to Marm Tash, and her relationship to Oxford Tash, who's connected to his wartime service. There's no public notice at the time of Oxford Tash's death, and their graves are not marked. Now we'll talk about Jude Hall. I'm going to get a sip of water first. You've all heard of Jude Hall, yes? Yes. Jude Hall's contribution to the American Revolution was never questioned. Oops, put this down. During his lifetime, he was known for having served as a soldier during the war. His nickname was Captain. He was not a captain, he was a private. Particularly his service at the Battle of Bunker Hill. And yet, many pieces of information about him are still unknown. All accounts agree that he is from Kensington, New Hampshire, and was enslaved to a man named Philemon Blake. Even the Blake family acknowledges this as fact. During his many enlistments, he states he is from Kensington. He is mentioned in both the Kensington town history and the Exeter town history. Both recognize his service during the war. And yet there are no accounts of Jude Hall published until after his death. Local accounts begin to surface in the 1870s, so what might have brought this about is uncertain, although there seems to be a correlation with his life story and the death of his only surviving son, George. People in town had certainly heard of Jude Hall, but perhaps they needed reminding, and that's why the stories came out. The earliest was published at the time of George Hall's death in 1874. The author was a Dr. Jeremiah Blake, a distant relative of the Blake family. Jeremiah Blake was born in 1800, and so he was living at the same time as Hall. However, he never mentions having met him. He published in the Pittsfield Star, which is where he was born and lived. I won't read the entire piece because it's really long, but there are some highlights about Jude Hall from someone who never met him. Jude Hall of Exeter, who was a man of great size and gigantic strength, the strongest man who ever lived in Exeter and perhaps in New Hampshire. The bones of his chest, that is his sternum and ribs, united with, seems like a breastplate of iron, there being but little flesh between the ribs. He was a soldier in the Revolutionary War and was in the Battle of Bennington. During the battle, his company was ordered to charge on a division of Hessians. These Hessians were thickly set men, usually weighing from 160 to 180 pounds. Different times. In this desperate charge, Jude was a host, clearing the enemy from the ground before him. He would run his bayonet through the bodies of these heavy men and throw them over his head like a boy spreading hay and tossing it over his head. While Jude had a Hessian on his bayonet, one of the foe made a pass at him, but fortunately his bayonet struck against Jude's breastbone, only causing a flesh wound. Later, this man tried to let Jude know that he was the man who had stabbed him and begged of Jude not to kill him. Jude replied, "Me no kill you today, but if I'd got you yesterday, I should." The writer is indebted to his father, who was brought up and lived many years near Jude Hall and was in the army with him. This account was republished in the Exeter newsletter, introducing the story of Jude Hall to many of the residents of Exeter. Weir Shaw, a Kensington correspondent for the Exeter newsletter, mentions Hall twice, helpfully placing his grave in the Winter Street Cemetery. Hall's final resting place had been unrecorded, but Weir twice mentions his burial at the Exeter Cemetery. In June of 1908, there was a colored man from this town in that battle. His name was Jude Hall. He died in Exeter in 1828, and his remains lie within the old cemetery near the old tomb. That's the Winter Street Cemetery. When on the retreat down the hill, a cannonball struck the ground under him and threw him heels over head. A white man by his side said to him, "You gone, Jude?" He answered, "No, by gosh," and ran for his life. He served all through the war till General Cornwallis surrendered. Exeter historian Charles Bell wrote of him. Another colored revolutionary pensioner was Jude Hall, who died in August of 1827 at the age of 80. He was a man of powerful physique, and it is said that parts of his ribs, which are usually cartilaginous, were of solid bone, so that his vital organs were enclosed in a sort of osseous case. He could write. I mean, really, Charles Bell. However, I mean, he is a lawyer and a politician, so you probably shouldn't take medical advice from lawyers and politicians. He lived on the old road to Kensington, near the line of that town. He was the chief witness of the government in the trial of John Blaisdell for the homicide of John Wadley, and was charged by the council with a disposition to stretch the truth, but not, however, with perjury. Here, Bell, who did not meet Hall, repeats the story of the fused rib cage, which is not a physical possibility, I should point out. My husband, the nurse practitioner, said, "Not if you want to breathe." There are so many other stories about Jude Hall. I don't even have time to relate them all today. Suffice to say, he's noted for his physical strength. He's noted for his service at the Battle of Bunker Hill with a story about getting thrown by a cannonball. He's noted for his fishing prowess and his large family. Considering the sheer volume of stories about Jude Hall in both Exeter and Kensington, we seem to have a great deal of information about him. However, many of the facts are quite suspect. A genealogist that I've had the pleasure of working with named, got her name here, Amy Taylor, says when she reads these stories, they sound like Big John Henry stories or something like that. They're just so fabulous. The stories are in agreement that Jude Hall was enslaved to Philemon Blake of Kensington, and even the Blake family has acknowledged this as fact. Philemon Blake was a farmer. The first truly documented instance we hear of Jude Hall is when he serves in the American Revolution at the Battle of Bunker Hill, and he does serve throughout the entire war. He was able to sign his name. You see in the middle, Jude Hall? Not only could he sign his name, he wrote a nice hand. The two men, the men on top and the man below his signature, put their mark on the thing, so those are white men who could not sign their own name, and Jude Hall could. He was able to sign his name quite clearly for his pay receipt. Many of the white soldiers in his regiment signed with an X. He's mustered out of service in 1783 as a private. On January 21st, 1786, Exeter Town Clerk records a marriage publishment for Jude Hall and Rhoda Paul. Whether the intention was solemnized, we cannot be certain. 1 year later, Jude and his family are issued a warning out from the town of Exeter. New residents were required to prove that they could support themselves for 12 months or they faced warning out, lest they become a public ward. This warning out states that the family had come to reside here before May of 1786, meaning that they had only lived in Exeter for 9 months, so they were told to leave. In 1790, Jude Hall is counted on the first U.S. Census as living in Exeter as a head of household with 5 free people of color. Yet 5 years later, he and Rhoda, along with their 5 children, are warned out yet again, having lived in town only 6 months. Their early married life appears to have been uprooted until they finally settled in a small house on the road to Kensington, which is Pickpocket Road? Nope, Drinkwater Road. Sorry, I always get those two mixed up. Drinkwater Road. This location is mentioned many times in the accounts, and there is currently great interest in finding the location of his home. The land is now owned by Phillips Exeter Academy, which is looking into the archaeological evidence to prove that a small cabin appeared on the land. This location is important because it's mentioned in a murder trial, which Jude Hall participated. His testimony is occasionally mentioned by writers. The holy grail of research about marginalized people is to find their own voices. Accounts, especially those written during the heyday of minstrel show stereotypes, often uses slave dialect when quoting people of color, such as Elvin Prescott, who is quoting Jude Hall here. "Oh no," said the old Negro, "I's done so many of them, they's got used to it." Hall testified as a witness to the events that occurred that evening. His answers are phrased similarly to those of his white neighbors. And that's his words. They wouldn't have looked out of place if he was ordering at Dunk's. He was a New Englander. He wouldn't have sounded like a Southern enslaved person. Stories about Jude Hall seem to border on tall tales, and perhaps they are, seemingly told most often to children. If he was, as one writer states, 5'10", that would make him tall for the time, but certainly not a giant. George Washington was considered towering at 6 feet, but he is not called a physical giant. Never once mentioned in all of these accounts about Jude Hall is the fate of 3 of his sons. Hall's son-in-law, Robert Roberts, published the fates of James, William, and Aaron. All 3 were kidnapped into enslavement while working as mariners. None returned, although Rhoda eventually heard from William. Rhoda, after Jude's death, submitted an affidavit to the Liberator in 1834. A neighbor, David Wedgwood, tried to assist James, who was the youngest, in securing passage as a ship's cook. The captain of the ship, Isaac Stone, states that James disappeared while the ship was docked at Annapolis. Records since recovered indicate that James was kidnapped there and shipped to New Orleans. Various Exeter people cited James over the years, but he was never able to make his way back to Exeter. Neither did his 2 brothers. The kidnapping and enslavement of 3 Exeter men would have been newsworthy in town, and yet there are no contemporary accounts. His only surviving son, George, was also well known in town. Like his father, he was a laborer, and after a time needed to apply for public assistance. George Hall had 3 sons, whom he named William, Aaron, and Moses. Moses was a bright boy and was able to get enough support to finish a course of study at Phillips Exeter Academy. He's recognized as the first black student to have attended Phillips Exeter. He became a skilled stonemason. His father, George, fared less well. After his children were grown, his wife deceased, he moved out of town, and he died of hypothermia alone in a cabin in Gilmanton. Jude Hall was well remembered in Exeter, although primarily for his strength and his war service. His unbearable losses are never mentioned in any of the accounts provided, except the accounts provided by his family. In 2015, after the Charleston shootings at the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church, a group formed in Exeter to address racial issues. Called the Racial Unity Team, the stated goal was one of education. The Exeter Historical Society was asked to draft a walking tour describing the town's more diverse history. The first walk-a-mile was held by the Racial Unity Team the following year. The tour evolved over time. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the society decided to do a deep dive into the history of the town's earlier black population. That single 3-inch manuscript box labeled African Americans has now expanded into 4 larger boxes, now occupying 2 linear feet of shelf space in the archives. Exeter author and member of the regional DAR, Renee Allen, proposed a memorial pocket park within the existing public space to recognize the Black Revolutionary War soldiers who'd come to Exeter after the war. Various ideas circulated among the committee that quickly formed. Should the monument be for only the soldiers or include their families? Perhaps the entire Black community should be recognized with engraved brickwork around the monument. Problems quickly arose. Who would be included? What if, as the research continued to show, new people continued to turn up as our inquiries dug deeper? Would a monument to Exeter's Black community imply that the community no longer exists in town, the way that indigenous peoples have been presumed to be dying race back in the 19th century? Thankfully, Exeter received some help from the New Hampshire Black Heritage Trail. Originally, the Portsmouth Black Heritage Trail, the organization was seeking to expand statewide. The questions we were encountering were the same ones that the New Hampshire Black Heritage Trail had been grappling with since it was first created. After numerous educational and wordsmithing Zoom meetings, the text of the monument began to take shape and was approved by the committee, the Town Select Board, and the New Hampshire Black Heritage Trail. The monument was dedicated on a rather raw day in 2024. Hannah Merrill and Jude Hall are two of the people recognized by name on that monument. In November of 2024, Renee succeeded in having the DAR marker erected in the Winter Street Cemetery, recognizing the contributions of New Hampshire's Black Revolutionary War soldiers. Phillips Exeter Academy continues to research the Hall family as caretakers of the Hall's home site and the accomplishments of Moses Hall. And the Exeter Historical Society continues the slow, plodding work that meticulous research requires. Each new piece of evidence is collected, verified, and added to our town's history. I have to give a big shout out and a thank you to Renee and to Amy Taylor, my genealogist friend, and to Hunter Stelz, an archaeologist who's been working on the home site to make a lot of this story more complete, and I did it. Well, under 45 minutes. Okay, I'll field any questions you might have. Or maybe none.
So there was no relationship between...
Gotta get the microphone.
There was no relationship officially between Jude Hall and Ona Judge, was there?
There is no relationship between Jude Hall and Una Judge.
None.
None.
Okay. For some reason I had in my head.
Una Judge was owned by Martha Washington, and she liberated herself to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and she was hounded and chased for the remainder of her life. But she died in Greenland, New Hampshire.
When the first one that you're talking about, when the gentleman took ownership, or not sure what the right term was, but with regards to the children, for the...
Guardianship, yeah.
Yeah, guardianship. When he had guardianship of them, were the children with him or with her, to our knowledge?
They stayed with their mother. It was really kind of a bond that was left. When Juba Merrill died, he apparently left money in his estate for the children, so the bond had to be given to a responsible person, which meant someone male and someone white. The original guardianship is in Hampton, and then it gets transferred to George Odeon in Exeter when she moves to Exeter. But she had to prove that she wasn't going to wind up in the pauper house in Exeter, and they were going to have to pay for her.
You had mentioned that at some point the Exeter schools were integrated. Did that, I don't know if you know the answer, but did that continue, or did they get segregated and reintegrated? What's the history there? It just seems like that would have been unusual, or maybe it wasn't.
The reason it was integrated was because it was just impractical to try to segregate the two groups. So black children who wanted to go to school certainly could. The only segregation we had in Exeter was when we split the girls and the boys into different school systems for a while. But there were a few young women who first went to the Robinson Seminary who were women of color. Some of them went on to be teachers in other locations. They couldn't get hired here, so they left, which was a loss for us of those young women. Could have had great teachers.
I
I understand that the black population in Exeter dropped precipitously at some point, or maybe around the Industrial Revolution.
Yep.
What can you tell
Just
us?
at exactly that time. The black population peaks in probably about 1810, 1820, and then it starts to decline. And it's just about the same time, right after that, and it's definitely after the Civil War, that there's more industrial work going on here in town, and the factories would not hire black workers. They just wouldn't. They would hire non-English speaking immigrants, but they wouldn't hire black people. So the loss of economic opportunity is probably the driving reason why a lot of the black population disappears. There's also a lot of intermarriage into the white population. Every person I've ever met who was a descendant of Jude Hall would present to you as white and would tell you they are white. So most of his descendants are now mixed in with the white population, and that happened quite often. In fact, Jude Hall's wife, Rhoda, was of mixed parentage to begin with. Her father was black and her mother was white.
Do we know how many slaves John Phillips owned? Of course, he formed Phillips Exeter Academy, founded in 1781. Do we know how many slaves he had?
We think about 3. They're not mentioned often. By the time of his death, these people were free. And he made provisions for Corydon, who he used to hire out to other people to work. He made provisions for him in his later life. That's how the town or the academy was able to pay for his room and board with Hannah Merrill. So he was provided for. The other 2 folks, I think one was named Dinah, and then there's another name that I can't recall off the top of my head right now. There was another man who was also owned by him. We're still kind of looking for them. There's a lot of slave owners in New Hampshire that we tend not to think about. All 3 signers from New Hampshire of the Declaration of Independence, William Whipple, Matthew Thornton, and Josiah Bartlett, all were slave owners. So, I mean, we don't think about that, but they were. Right, one more.
If there were people who were freed because they served in the military in the Revolutionary War, how were their owners economically compensated, or were their owners economically
They were
compensated?
not.
Okay.
And we actually don't know, since there's no manumission papers that I've been able to find, we don't know whether someone like Jude Hall, we've heard that Jude Hall has different stories. One story is that he ran away so that he could serve in the military, but I mean, he came right back here, so that would not have been safe. Robert Tash is Oxford Tash, again, we don't know whether he made some sort of deal with his owner at that time, Colonel Tash, or how that came about. So whether they were freed before they started to serve in the military or whether they were freed as a result of their service is not too clear. We simply don't know. Could have been either way. Okay, well, thank you for coming out on such a hot night.